So, Renato, did Jack Smith's report about January 6th even matter?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a skeet. So, Asha, we had big news, right? Special Counsel Jack Smith releases his report, or at least the first volume of it. Oh my God. Asha went to Kinko's, Staples, and got it. I know when I did that for the Mueller report, it cost me like $100-something to get it.
This was like 45.
I know, but isn't that insane, by the way? I just
It is kind of insane.
So yes, I read it on my iPad. What I did.
It's just too these long things. Like, I'm getting old. I can't read this stuff on the computer.
We should that needs to be that. We'll do that at the end. Our segment about how we cope with that and what we're doing.
Yeah,
I think
I
have a lot to say about actually how I've done that. But getting back to Jack Smith for a second, I had some people tell me they were so interested in my analysis they couldn't wait to hear what I had to say. There was an element to which was so anticlimactic because he's releasing a report. His investigation got stopped essentially by the election and the results of the election, the ascension of Donald Trump as president. And I think part of it, I'm going to say, is actually a positive thing in a certain way, is that we already knew so many of the facts. I do think that was a positive. But what do you think, Asha?
I think that's right. And I mean, I think it's just gotten caught up too much in, the hearings this week, the inauguration coming up. I mean, there's a lot of noise happening. And as we know, our media is not great at kind of focusing on, not that these other things aren't important, but you know what I'm saying? It did not have the splash. And I think there's a little bit of, we're now at a point where it's like, oh yeah, another special counsel report. Wah, wah.
Yeah. I mean, I think people have learned that this doesn't matter. I mean, for years, Asha, I was kind of beating a drum beat that if we kept talking, there's this hype train always that like Trump was going down, Trump was going down, Trump was going down. And at a certain point, people have gotten wise to it. It's like, it's like, okay, well, this doesn't really matter at this point. Like I think all, thought, okay, maybe something's going to really happen in the Mar-a-Lago case, and then in the January 6th case. But by now, I mean, it was apparent that this was not happening before the election. And then with the election, obviously, nothing's going to happen here. But I think part of it, I was saying a moment ago, it's a positive, is that what happened with the January 6th committee was very unusual. Very, very, very unusual in a criminal case. In most criminal
cases, prosecution, you mean, not the committee?
No, I do mean the committee.
Oh,
and that's so. Here's what I mean by that. It is very rare for Congress or any public body to investigate and report on the facts of a matter, including public interviews of witnesses, before a criminal investigation. Typically, what happens is criminal investigation comes first, in secret, because it has to for it's grand jury secrecy. And all we get are dribs and drabs of leaks from witnesses' attorneys or something. And then after all of it, you start learning what happened in the public, and there's a lot of discussion. The Mueller investigation is a great example. That's typical for a case. There's this long investigation, and then suddenly you find out. It's like for, let's say, P. Diddy or any of these cases, right? Big, high-profile cases occurred. It's not like there was the New York legislature is holding hearings to discuss and interview witnesses to what P. Diddy was doing. So this was very unusual. Now, there was reasons for it, and we've discussed some of that at length. But I actually think my point being is part of the reason that there was a wind out of the sails of the January 6th report is that, unlike the Mueller report, it wasn't like, wow, this witness said this or this witness said that, because we had already heard from those witnesses in real time, and most of the really important details were already known. I mean, there were things that were new in a certain way in the in the Jack Smith report, but really what was new, Asha, was his thinking, his strategy, his legal reasoning, why he brought certain charges, why he didn't, not the facts, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. What did you find was new about the case?
Well, a few things. One was, I actually think if you, let's just say you're a busy person and you're like, I got 3 kids. I've got a lot to do. I don't have time to read the Jack Smith report. I'm not like Asha is going to go to Staples and get my $90 or $40, whatever it is, copy of the Jack Smith report. Well, I would suggest doing is go to the PDF, read the letter from Jack Smith at the beginning, and then scroll to the end and read kind of the Trump response and what Jack Smith says in response to that. I think it's interesting. That's sort of like if you're very crunched on time. And I'll tell you kind of some of the interesting nuggets there. The interesting nugget there is, Jack Smith in his cover letter defends his team very aggressively, characterizes himself as a career prosecutor. This is not a guy, most people who are federal prosecutors do kind of what I did, where you have a career, you're in private practice, you go to the U.S. Attorney's Office, you spend X number of years there, and then you leave, and then you do something else. That is not Jack Smith. Jack Smith has, for decades, been working in the Justice Department and other forms of public service for various capacities. So he defends that. He defends the decisions that he made, the charging decisions he made. He makes very clear that he had the evidence to win, and he was going to win these trials. He's very confident about it. He did not have to do that. And I will just say, he's a different approach from Robert Mueller. Like if we compare Robert Mueller, the man, and Jack Smith, the man, and the prosecutor of them, Robert Mueller's view, and I actually have a lot of respect for that view. I have a lot of respect for Robert Mueller, much more than most. I think most people who critiqued his investigation, is he's like, I'm going to say as little as possible. And if I don't have to say something, I'm not going to say something about people who I didn't charge or people who, the decisions I didn't have to make or whatever. Like, Robert Mueller, if you asked him, would probably say, I don't know how. I believed that I had sufficient evidence to convict, but I don't know about the outcome of a trial. So I'm not going to say anything about that. I wouldn't have charged the cases if I didn't think I could do it, but that's inherent in the Justice Department policy. Whereas Jack Smith came out there and said it. So I thought that part of the cover letter was very interesting.
Well, I also think that Robert Mueller was investigating and writing his report in a different time than Jack Smith is. Correct. And in many ways, I think that Robert Mueller was writing a report for a time that had already passed at the time that he issued it, which is, people are going to read the report and take it at face value and maybe debate, the law and the facts or whatever it is. I wrote a piece for my Substack about this is at the start of when Jack Smith was appointed, about how Mueller did not understand the concept of information warfare and that there is an asymmetry in the information space when the Department of Justice follows its norms of not commenting on anything beyond what it does in its own filings or adding any sort of editorialization or anything like that. And what it does is it creates a vacuum for other narratives and often false narratives to be promulgated and then get circulated and take over the space. And I think Jack Smith's letter recognizes that. I think what he realizes is, I have to tell a story. I have to have a counter narrative to the one that has been put out there. And I think he was even restrained in all of this. And he mostly spoke through his filings. But in this final moment, I think it is responding to accusations that this was politicized, that this was meritless or whatever. I just don't see how. I think it would have been irresponsible of him to not respond to that. And I think the other piece to me that is important and new here is the section on investigative challenges and litigation issues, some of which we know about, things like the immunity case in the Supreme Court, but some, like Twitter trying to block his search warrants, and just, the roadblocks that he came against that really slowed down. And, and also he mentions, by the way, threats and harassment of witnesses. I think that's a really important piece to document in here. So I do think that I think it was an appropriate letter, and I think it's an appropriate letter given this moment. 15 years ago, no. I think it would have been kind of like what Comey did in his, weird press conference where he slammed Hillary Clinton even though he wasn't charging her. Here he actually, I mean, he did charge Trump, and I think he's saying, and I would have won this case.
Right. And he did talk about in the cover letter. I was going to suggest, you kind of stole my thunder with that. I was going to suggest is I was like, if you have only one kid and not three, or, you have a little bit more time, I do think the part kind of, there's a whole section there where he talks about his charging decisions, which I think are very interesting. We could talk about that in a minute, but also talks about some of the issues he said in the report itself. I think that's very interesting. That's the part that I think is the most interesting part of the report to people who are following the news. Like if you haven't been under a rock, but you mentioned a moment ago, you're drawing a comparison between the time that Mueller was in and the time that Jack Smith is in. And I think there's another important difference between the two. And that's where I thought you were going until you said something different is, Robert Mueller was investigating a man that he knew he couldn't charge. And he knew that from the beginning. And Andrew Weissman and I have discussed this a number of times. Andrew constantly says that we knew from the beginning we weren't going to be able to charge Trump. So that was never an issue. We always thought it was silly that there's all sorts of discussion and thoughts about that because that was never going to happen. And so we knew that from the beginning. And I think as a result, Robert Mueller was issuing a report about the sitting president. And he was, in his mind, bound by certain policies that the Justice Department has about commenting about people who are uncharged. And also he felt in terms of fairness that he went even further because this was somebody who couldn't be charged and couldn't defend himself in court and blah, blah. We can debate that. I feel like that's been discussed to death. But my point is Jack Smith is in a position where he's currently talking about a private citizen who he did charge. And it's very different about when a prosecutor's talking about a case he did charge than a case that he didn't. And obviously, there's been a lot said, and Trump's had his words in public and in court on these charges.
Well, and speaking about information asymmetry and information vacuums, let's remember what Trump did with Mueller's attempt to be fair and impartial or whatever, give Trump the full benefit of the doubt. Trump came out, and actually Bill Barr first really came out to say this was total exoneration. In other words, it was characterized in that way. So I also think that a part of Smith saying, if this had gone to trial, I would have won, is to make clear that this is not a total exoneration.
I think that's right.
This is really just the clock ran out.
I agree. And I also think, you're talking about different times. One thing I also point out is Smith has the benefit of seeing how things played out for Mueller. In other words, I think Mueller had an expectation of how things would occur that didn't. I mean, he was clearly upset at how Barr had misled people regarding his report, but and had private conversations about a different mentality and style that Smith would have had even in those circumstances. But nonetheless, Smith saw that. He saw where this is going. And by the way, Smith's also somebody who, unfairly but understands that he's going to be a target very soon. Just to get to some of the points that you were raising, which I thought were very interesting. In addition to some of the obstacles, and I thought it was interesting him kind of talking at length about Trump's attempts to intimidate witnesses and the difficulty of procuring witnesses. He also talks about some of the charging decisions he made and why. One thing that you and I and many others had discussed for a long time is whether incitement to violence is something that, would be charged. And he kind of explains why he didn't do that and the litigation risk involved, which is very similar to some of, I think, the discussions we had, for example.
Yeah, I think it is interesting given that, there's not a ton that's new here. There wasn't any like crazy bombshell or anything. Why Trump and his team were fighting so hard to prevent this from being released, because there were all the shenanigans happening in Judge Aileen Cannon's court of imaginary jurisdiction, where she was, kept this case alive somehow to try to bury it. And I mean, the only conclusion that I can come to is if this had not been released as of tomorrow, we never. I mean, it just never. It would have been. I think it would probably just be destroyed. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? And so, like, this would never. I think there would have been no historical record. And I think beyond just there being a historical record, people can say, who cares now? I think it's important. And I think it's especially important for what you said before, that Jack Smith is now a target, because he's now chronicled exactly what you said, his thinking, his strategy, his decisions, why he prosecuted some people, why he chose not to prosecute some people, the challenges that he went. And if you'll recall this week during her confirmation hearings, Pam Bondi was not willing to say that she would not investigate Jack Smith. She's like, I will have to look at the file and I'll have to look at the case. And, Renato, I hate to say this, but at this point, I am not confident that we are going to have a Justice Department that would be beyond ginning up evidence or, fabricating allegations that there was prosecutorial misconduct or whatever. And I think that becomes harder to do now that there is a very clear chronicle of exactly how this case unfolded. It's not impossible. It's just harder.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that it certainly matters for history. I guess my take about why they were fighting so hard, in my opinion, is that Trump fights everything against his enemies all the time. And I think at times it's actually a big weakness. It really hurt him. I mean, I'd written an op-ed about the Manhattan case. I thought that was a mistake there. Fighting everything to the hilt there was not the right strategy. But I think if there's a weakness in terms of the strategy that he's undertaking, it's that it's like fight, go, 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 go. And anybody who does a lot of fighting in court and outside of court knows that there can be times where taking a more deft approach and taking a lighter touch on things can be valuable. That was probably not worth the fight. I actually think if he just let the report come out, there wouldn't have been that much coverage. There wasn't that much coverage when it did come out. He actually generated more interest and hype and attention for it and made himself look like an obstructionist. And then he was scared of it coming out. And realistically, even if it wasn't released to the public, Jack Smith had it sent, or Garland had it sent to Congress, right? It was sent to the ranking member. It's not like it would have been lost in time. Like, you got to imagine some Democratic senator or member of Congress is going to keep that.
But I don't think he sent it as long as the injunction was in place.
Oh, I see. That's interesting. Yeah. Well, from my perspective, this report was interesting. We had an important historical record. It mattered more to me. I also had mentioned earlier, by the way, the ending piece, which I thought, if you have very little time, is interesting to take a look at, because you can see the Trump response to it, the Trump team response to it, which is not factual at all. It's just attacking. It's like just attacking Smith in the process, which, that's a bad sign when that's all you've got. Okay. Mm-hmm. Is when you're focused on that. And Smith's response, which essentially points that out. I think that's interesting. But I think in the end, my view on it actually is that Smith is in a strong position to fight off a prosecution, regardless whether he wrote things in writing or not. Because what he did in court speaks for itself. And a lot of 90% of what he did here was already done in court. So I think he's in a strong position either way, and I hope he doesn't get prosecuted.
Well, it also documents all the evidence that he gathered.
True. That's the important. I think it's more of a historical thing.
If you'll recall, that was another question that was asked during Pam Bondi's hearing of whether she would ensure that no evidence concerning the investigations in January 6th would be destroyed. And I don't believe she answered that question. So what we know, I mean, I think, we did have this from the January 6th committee. I think that's one of the best, reasons, biggest contributions that committee made was having so much of this public in terms of testimony and people talking about their firsthand accounts of what happened. Because, with this criminal investigation, we obviously have this documentation, but the actual evidence, the interviews, the 302s, like things that were gathered, are now in the hands of the Justice Department. And if Trump orders Attorney General Pam Bondi to destroy it, there's really no repercussion. That's not obstruction of justice anymore. It's not obstruction of justice for Trump. I would argue that under the unitary executive theory that the court seems to now, have bought whole hog. I don't think it would be obstruction of justice for Pam Bondi to do it, but even if it were, he can pardon her. So I just think it's all going to disappear. And this is literally all we have left.
Yeah, I think one thing that will be, I think this is a more, two things, two kind of thoughts on that. First, I think that this matters more from a historical perspective, because this is literally American history at this point. This is going to be, I think, studied for centuries to come. But can you imagine if the January 6th committee didn't do what it did? And we had an election and Trump won. And then, because Trump won despite the January 6th committee, okay? It's not because of it. So he won. And then this report gets released after the election, right? It'd be insane. And there'd be this whole thing. Well, hey, if only we knew this, what would have happened? I mean, here, the American people deserve to know all of that, what happened on January 6th before they made a decision. So I think that was a real public service that the January 6th committee did, much more in a deeper way than we understood at the time, even, in my opinion. Secondly, I think another real question that's going to be asked, like if we're looking in the months ahead, is, did the Justice Department, including Jack Smith, make the right decision regarding volume 2 of the report? In other words, one thing we've talked about is, could you have dismissed out those other 2 defendants and then released that volume? And what happens to that volume of the report, where there may be more that is not public, in part because there's so much secret information and as a result, national, countervailing concerns that would countervail against transparency. That might mean that the pleadings aren't as descriptive as they otherwise would be, whereas in the January 6th context they were. So we'll see. But I think it's interesting, and it really says something that this wasn't a big bombshell. We weren't rushing to make an emergency podcast in this one.
Well, get your copy now while you can.
So, Asha, I'm going to make a bit of a prediction. I think that next week, I wouldn't be surprised if our first segment is going to be about crypto something or another, because Trump is very focused. There's a lot of reports that he's going to be doing a lot in crypto. He's going to potentially kind of upend the way, how he's going to kind of create a way to regulate it. He's going to be potentially making that a national focus for one way or the other. And it's interesting. I'm going to say something as somebody who practices some in that space and knows a good amount of the industry about that industry, is I actually think that the Biden administration's approach towards that space was one of the biggest mistakes of the Biden administration and contributed to Trump's win and the Democrats' loss. I mean, ultimately it was Harris, not Biden, but it was an extraordinarily foolish approach that I think it's not a mistake that Trump is doing this way.
Yeah, I just finished reading Michael Lewis's Going Infinite, which is about the rise and fall of FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. In fact, I think that case was happening right when you and I started this podcast. So if you have joined us only recently or in the last year, you can go back to one of our earliest episodes, and we were talking about Sam Bankman-Fried. But I have to say, in reading it, one of the things that actually made me feel a lot better about myself after reading that book is, I don't really get crypto. And it was pretty clear from reading that book that Michael Lewis doesn't get it either. And
no shit.
Guy. And even the person that was hired to be the custodian of FTX after it declared bankruptcy was very skeptical. And, he referred to all of these cryptocurrencies as shit coins. And so, To me, I feel like there's always some weird, like it's like somebody's trying to do a Jedi mind trick on me when they're explaining crypto. Because look, I took econ 101 and 102 in college. I'm very good at math. It doesn't add up to me like how this actually works. It just feels like at best just gambling, and at worst like some sort of like Nigerian scam where somebody's going to tell me to give money and there's going to be, a bank account in Africa that has $1 billion in it. That's kind of always how I end up leaving, trying to understand crypto. So explain it to me like I'm 5, Renato.
Okay, I will do that. I will just say,
Explain
by
it
the
to me
way,
like I'm 5.
before I say that, I want to just say I have not read Michael Lewis's book because everybody I know who has read it, including all the reviews, are just like, it is a complete piece of garbage. It's apologia for one of the biggest fraudsters of our time. So you can go back and yes, that is how it's. I mean, that's what most people are saying, because Sam Bankman-Fried's like a big time fraudster. We could talk about that.
Oh, I agree. I
Yeah,
did not. Did they read the same book? Because
yeah,
he seems like a completely awful person to
yeah.
me.
He is an awful person. So
Yeah,
yeah. Complete scumbag.
I
Okay.
did not read it as an apologia.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I did not.
That's interesting. A lot of people have read it that way. But let's talk about crypto for a
Yeah,
minute,
let's talk
okay?
about crypto.
So let me just say this. I want to start with something. One way I think an easy way to explain crypto is a starting point. Like there's more to it than this. But to some extent, like people are like, okay, well, Bitcoin, like why are people buying it? Why is it valuable? This and that. One thing I'm just going to start with is we understand that things of value, right, don't always have an inherent that like currency. United States currency has a value because it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, and there's a law that says that it's must be accepted for all debts, public and private. Okay, but things that don't fit, that aren't U.S. currency, have value, and people trade them for all sorts of arbitrary reasons, like baseball cards. It's not like a card with Mickey Mantle's picture on it, a piece of cardboard, has some inherent value, but people have decided that they want Mickey Mantle's photo on this baseball card, and it has an enormous amount of value. So what is Bitcoin, and why does that have value? I mean, Bitcoin is essentially it's a token that in which transactions involving Bitcoin are all public. So there's no question as to your ownership of Bitcoin, and everyone can see who owns it and which wallet controls that piece of Bitcoin and where the transactions have been regarding it. It is rare. In other words, it is created by various computing. I don't want to get into the details, but essentially it's created over time, and the total amount of Bitcoin that will ever be in existence is already known, and it's going down dramatically. Almost all of it already exists. And so what's the value of Bitcoin? I would think of Bitcoin, because that's what people think about with crypto, which is not correct, because it's only a tiny sliver of it. It's like a digital gold sort of thing. In other words, why is gold valuable? It's not its industrial use, I'll tell you that much, or even it's just that people decided it was pretty, and it's always been valuable, and it's scarce, and yada, yada, yada. And so people, if they're concerned about regular currencies, put money into gold. That's sort of what Bitcoin is, whether you want to use baseball cards or gold. That's how I would view Bitcoin, like a digital gold. But there are other tokens that have value and provide value outside of that. And I'll give you probably a one example is, you probably also heard of something called Ethereum. Mm-hmm. That has sort of a smart contract quality to it that is innovative, which is that you can program Ether as a token out there that you neither, let's say that to have certain conditions. So you can actually use it like there are trust issues that you and I might have. For example, there might be an amount of money where we want it only released under certain conditions. And you traditionally have to use an escrow or do something else, pay some third party essentially, and create a bunch of legal documents to do that. But you could program Ether essentially to release money on certain conditions and not others. Okay. So Ether is essentially a form of crypto that has functionality in it. I think that's the best way of explaining it. And there are other forms of crypto that also have functionality associated with them, like they distribute file sharing or do other things. That's one form of crypto that has an actual use. There are other forms of crypto that are useful for a different purpose. One thing that people have probably heard about is something called a stable coin.
Mm-hmm. That's actually backed by real money.
Right. And so why have stable coins then?
It's not a shit coin.
No, it is literally traded one for its price is fixed to, let's say, United States dollar.
Right.
There's something called USDC. It's backed by dollars, and its value is always $1. So why do we have it? Well, one of the reasons we have it right now, it's very popular right now, is they trade. If you want to trade crypto, it's actually hard at times to transfer crypto into dollars, actual dollars. So you can just trade them for those coins, and it's effectively the same thing. You trade it for USDC, and you're getting dollars. Okay, it's a way of doing that, but it has another use as well. A lot of people don't have access to traditional bank accounts. In fact, around the world, only a fraction of people do. And so it's a way, if you don't have access to traditional banking, to have value or store value or trade or whatever. It's something that's valuable. Last category I'll give you before we move on to the next question is there are things called, and people have heard of things called NFTs. And others, there's all sorts of things around that. But the point is, there are things that are actually much more like baseball cards, just to bring it full circle, where it's like, hey, here's the one piece of ultimate artwork, because digital creators can't, you create some digital piece of art and everyone just copies it. And so it's a way of saying, well, this is the one piece that is valuable. There's my one Mona Lisa. But they sometimes have functionality included in them. Like DraftKings includes, you're essentially betting on baseball players and football players and NBA and whatever, based on, owning Patrick Mahomes' card. Essentially, you're betting on his performance effectively. It's much more complicated than that, but there are people who created NFTs with those qualities. So is that helpful to give a sense of this?
It's
space?
helpful, but okay, here's my pushback for you. So let's first start with the whole baseball card analogy. Okay. Right. Baseball cards don't just, they're not just cards of like random freaking people, right?
True.
They are cards of players who in real life actually do something. And so the value of the card is actually a reflection of some sort of external value that people place on a celebrity status of this particular athlete or their exceptional athletic ability. In other words, the reason the Mickey Mantle card is valuable is not just because it's scarce, though I think the scarcity piece is important. It's that he's a really good baseball player and like everybody, he's admired. And in other words, there is some link between something to the external world. Now, I get that there have been in the past, like collectibles and commodities that, I don't know, garbage pail kids or something like that.
Right.
Which, but I think for something to have the lasting value, it's because it is backed by a consensus that it reflects something or is otherwise backed by something of value. Okay. So that's that. I just wanted to put that piece out there. On the NFT thing, I'm sorry, but that was like the dumbest thing I had ever heard in my life. My ex-boyfriend this was like 3 years ago, was like NFTs are it. And I was like, I don't get this. Like, why would I pay money for this digital thing? And he's like, because you would own it on the blockchain. I'm like, but why do I care? I can literally like copy it and screenshot it. He's like, you could use it as your avatar on Twitter. And I'm like, but I can do that now. And so there were these like dumb like gorilla artworks. Do you remember that were going?
Oh, I know. Bored apes. Yeah.
And I actually, when I was reading Going Infinite, I was like, what happened to NFTs? And if you look now, like NFTs, pretty much they're all worthless.
So yeah, that particular NFT, part of what you're getting is actually, if you bought them and you were one of the people who owned them, you were actually kind of part of a club, effectively, of people who did, and they had like get-togethers in real life, and you were effectively buying exclusivity and admission.
Right, there was something external that
Correct.
had value.
But my point is, you can do that with NFTs. So the example I gave you about DraftKings, those are NFTs. Now they discontinued the program because of what the SEC did and other things. But my point being is, like, it was a Patrick Mahomes digital card that it was an NFT of that Patrick Mahomes photo, but it had something external on it. Like you could enter their gambling crap, right? With, whatever. Some people love gambling, but the point is you can enter their gambling stuff with it. Right. So my point being is there is, what we are seeing now, to bring it home to people is what we're seeing now is the equivalent of like pets.com. Like when the internet, you and I were in law school, when the internet was just becoming a thing, World Wide Web was just exploding and everybody was creating internet companies all over the place. And a lot of them were dumb and a lot of them were, some of them became extraordinarily valuable. That's where we are with crypto. Some of the ideas are good and are going to have some lasting value. Most aren't. But one problem is a difference in approach between the Clinton administration with the internet and the Biden administration of crypto. Clinton administration worked with Congress, passed a bunch of laws to give a lot of freedom and ability for the internet to grow. And the SEC under Biden decided we're going to just sue every single crypto provider, even ones who are trying to be compliant and have all these lawyers and are running around trying to comply with us and want us to have a regulatory framework. We're not going to create a regulatory framework for you. We're not going to allow you to register. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to sue all of you.
Well, FTX claimed to be one of those companies that was going to be in compliance and was going to be ultra regulated. And that's why it was going to be the most trustworthy thing. And it was a big scam.
I agree.
I'm sorry, but have you heard about this Hawk to a Girl that, they created a coin for that? Yeah. That's a scam too.
True.
Coin. I don't know a lot, but I'm going to be willing to guess that that's a scam.
So I'm not going to talk about all these specific cases, but I will just say this. I have to be careful with conflicts. But what I will say is this. That's right. I think that so I will just tell you this, Asha, I'll reveal something in this podcast. So I originally thought that the reason the Biden administration took the approach they did to crypto was because of Sam Bankman-Fried. What I thought happened, my theory, and I thought it was actually a very smart theory, I think, because it would have made more sense, is that they saw that Sam Bankman-Fried was a big time fraudster. He said that he was trustworthy and he said all the right things, but he was a big time fraudster and he had contributed a lot of money to Democrats. Democrats had to go hard against crypto because of Sam Bankman-Fried. It turns out that Gary Gensler, the chair of the SEC, said all sorts of crazy crap, crazy shit behind closed doors to all sorts of people, telling all the crypto companies they're going to have to close up shop and fire all their employees and do all the stuff before that. Here's what I would say. I wouldn't paint with a broad brush about crypto. There are other people who are committing fraud with crypto. Yeah. There are people who commit fraud with stocks and bonds and futures and everything else. Yes. When you don't have regulation, it's easier to commit fraud. You don't have people, you don't have audits, you don't have rules, you don't have compliance. And I've never heard of a Democratic Party being against regulation of business. And the idea that you're not going to regulate this space was freaking crazy. In my opinion, when you have people sending you letters saying, please tell us how to register, please tell us how to be regulated, please give us rules and regulations, and they say no, I think that's fucking nuts. And I am about as anti-Trump as anyone gets. And I do think he is going to use this as an opportunity to create more profits for himself. But we as Democrats gave him an opportunity here, because I think a lot of these people would have been totally fine if the Biden administration said, okay, here's our super duper regulatory framework. They would have, there are people that would have gone along with that. It was stupid.
Okay. Pushback here. All right. I agree with you. So to some degree. So clearly when you look at kind of the story of FTX, what's happening, there's no clarity on what this is. So we can talk about this in a second. I'm curious what you think the regulations will look like. So my understanding is that there is a debate on whether crypto is a commodity or a security. Now, Bitcoin is treated as a commodity. It's treated like a trading card, right? Like a baseball card, basically.
Correct.
But I think there are other cryptocurrencies that are treated as securities. And so FTX, for example, their token, the FTT, operated as a security. It was essentially a share in the company itself. These create two different regulatory frameworks. So I'm interested in where you think it's going and why that will help anything. I just want to point out that one of the reasons that Sam Bankman-Fried set up shop in the Bahamas is that the whoever the chief, the SEC
government there, yeah.
equivalent person there was a very smart woman who basically saw this vacuum globally that said,
Right.
if we create actual rules for people to operate, this can become a place where people do business. And then we're not entirely reliant on, tourists and cruise ships, which had devastated their economy during
Right.
COVID. So this was kind of a way to expand, their economic, opportunities for that island. They came up with extensive rules and regulations for crypto, which is exactly why Sam Bankman-Fried showed up there. And P.S. 2 years later, he was arrested in the Bahamas.
True. I mean, he also had a
mean,
U.S. regulated piece too, by the way.
He did have an FTX US. But my point is that, what that told me is you need the rules and regulations, but you need oversight. In other words, if you don't have the kind of auditing and disclosures and record keeping, then the rules don't really matter. So, I mean, I'm interested in what regulations, quote unquote, the Trump administration, but I'm especially interested in how is the enforcement piece going to work?
Yeah.
Because we can barely keep, normal companies in line. I mean, after Enron, we had to pass a whole law to just make companies do accurate accounting and use proper accounting practices.
Well, one thing I want to point out, it wasn't just Bermuda. I mean, the UK, EU, like tons of other countries started rushing out regulatory frameworks to essentially steal business from the United States. And the goal was to basically get as many of these companies to move offshore as possible. And there was an effort to move. But what I would say about the security versus commodity thing, it's a bit of an artificial distinction that is baked into our law, just so everyone understands. The SEC regulates securities. Commodity Future Trading Commission, which I do a lot of practice in front of, regulates things like swaps and derivatives and futures. And they're very separate. And it's a big question. Are you a security? Are you a commodity? And it's been what the focus of the law is. You could have literally, if Gensler just came out on day one and said, all cryptos are security, here's our new rules, and the commission promulgated those, it probably would have been just fine. They had the authority to do it. He just didn't do it that way. I think that the industry wants the CFTC. Why? Because first of all, they've all been sued by the SEC for the last several years, and they're mad and hate the SEC. But also, they're going to like the new chair. But I think also the CFTC is smaller and has less resources and is going to be less aggressive about regulation. They're more friendly, more of a friendly agency. And so I do think, in an ideal world, you would have a sharing between those two agencies, or a lot of new resources of the CFTC. What do I think Trump might do? He might literally just say, oh, we're going to have Doge come up with some new idea, or I'm just going to have some guy in the White House do it, or whatever. It could potentially be a mess. I don't know. But what I do know is that from talking to a lot of people in the industry, like a lot of the really smart people in the industry, I do think that the industry is pushing for what you're suggesting, enforcement and rules, and something very robust, because they believe that their industry will grow more and they will do better and they will make more money if more people like you have faith in what they're doing and they're able to create products.
In which industry are you referring to? The crypto industry or the bank industry?
The crypto industry.
Okay.
Because they not only want access to banks, which, I mean, there's like a shadow operation to debank big crypto companies, publicly traded crypto companies. So, Coinbase and crypto.com and a lot of those companies were getting debanked because behind the scenes, Gary was doing stuff.
Well, and this to me just kind of brings it full circle to what I think is kind of dumb here. What's entire purpose of crypto, as I understand it, that this Bitcoin grew out of this white paper that
the Satoshi wrote.
Who wrote that we need a whole system that's based on trust, and there's no government intermediary, and where we're going, we don't need banks and we don't need regulators. We're gonna all just believe each other, and we're just all
sure. That turned out to be wrong.
Where are we? We're back, we're literally back to we need banks and we need
Sure.
regulators.
But it's
And
just
then
like, Asha,
why don't we just use regular money?
well, you and I are old enough to remember when the internet came out and everyone said that was going to bring freedom and was going to be a libertarian paradise and we'd all have the First Amendment. It didn't work out that way, but that doesn't mean there's nothing to the technology. So my prediction is crypto is going to be around long term. There's some innovative elements to it. Certain coins are going to exist and they're going to be relevant and others are not. It's going to be highly regulated and all the big banks are going to get into it. But it's going to take a while for that to get sorted out. And it'll be interesting to see, but there's gonna be a lot of movement there. It's a big move. It's going to matter for your life eventually, but maybe not today.
Well, and I just want to also point out, I mean, there are national security implications to this because cryptocurrency is a way for many rogue countries to basically evade sanctions. I mean, this is exactly how North Korea finances itself. It goes around hacking banks and stealing cryptocurrency or launder. Cryptocurrency is also a money laundering vehicle. So, I think it's not all rainbows and unicorns.
Well, a bigger foreign policy implication, and then we can move on because we could spend an hour talking about it, is right now the United States dollar is the default currency for the world. If and when that ever changed, it would mean that United States sanctions are much less powerful. And that is a big fear from a foreign policy world, is that other countries in the world will start, transferring some of, the default currency might move, and that would be bad for the United States of America. I'll just leave it at that. I mean, that's a bit, there's a lot of really interesting, smart discussion and debate about that right now. So Asha, before we go, you were talking about the difficulty of reading without using paper. And I will tell you, during the pandemic, made a massive shift away from paper because I did have a good printer at home, but the amount of paper that I used to go through for my law practice was kind of embarrassing. And it just seemed insane to be printing out at home hundreds and hundreds of pages of paper every week and then getting an industrial shredder and shredding all of it essentially. And so I actually spend much of my life having a screen in front of me, just like I do now, and then having my iPad Pro, and then I have something called a Remarkable, and I use both of them.
Heard about Remarkable?
Yeah, Remarkable is exceptional. So between these two things, I don't really need to use paper much at all. So
okay. I might need to move to the tablet. So, I mean, how's your eyesight? How's your eyesight doing?
It is starting to go in terms of I am getting, my doctor says I have another year or two. He changed my prescription purposely to give me another year or two. But I am basically at the age now where if I hold my phone a certain distance, I got to be thoughtful about where I can hold my phone. But I'm not constantly doing.
So you have contacts?
I do.
Okay.
Yep. So I have contacts, but unfortunately I'm nearsighted. Okay. But now if I can't read near, it's more complicated. Right. So, it's going to be an issue for me, but I have an iPad Pro, which is amazing resolution. It's also, by the way, what I use for TV appearances because it's got the best camera you can buy. And so that has an awesome resolution. You get one much bigger than this. My wife has a massive iPad. So if you want to have a big screen, I use it because I can have, let's say, one of my colleagues, associates will send me an email, an outline, and I could be talking to a client or something, and I have this in front of me and I can change what's on it constantly.
Yeah.
Whereas the Remarkable is like a replacement for a pad of paper.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good idea. So my eyesight is deteriorating. A long time ago, I needed glasses for distance. Before I went to the FBI Academy, I had to get
LASIK or something.
What's that?
You have to do LASIK or something?
No, I wasn't a bad. I did not, okay. And actually, they didn't take you at that time if you had LASIK. I was in a correctable range. It wasn't fully 20/20, but so when I would go to the firing range, I'd have these aviator glasses with, so I looked really cool on the range. Anyway, and since then, I've used it when driving, movies, plays, whatever. But yes, now I also find it hard to read things that are close up. Like I wear glasses now to watch TV, which is like
Oh,
literally,
wow.
6 feet from me. Um, and so I'm going to be getting my first set of progressive lenses.
Yeah, my doctor told me 2 years maybe. I've got maybe a year or two left, basically, because I'm at the spot
I'm
where I'm,
depressed.
kind of pushing things to and from. I mean, the Remarkable you can also use for the purpose that I just said, like transferring things to it. Like you could put a PDF. I'll send PDFs to my Remarkable, and it's an e-ink tablet, so it's like reading from a Kindle or something. But I don't do that because my time is very limited. Like I work 3,000 hours a year right now. And so accordingly, being able to just quickly just go into my emails and pull up the doc that somebody just sent me and immediately put it up is much easier than getting things over to my Remarkable.
Yeah.
But I mean, the Remarkable is a complete replacement for pen and paper.
Yeah. Well, I need to do something. I mean, part of we started this conversation because, the Jack Smith report came out and there's just
Yes.
no way that I'm reading that on my laptop. I will say, like, it's just I'm still finding it hard to I'll have to see how the iPad goes because there's just something about having paper in my hand, like something that I can flip pages that makes me feel good.
Then you would love the Remarkable because it's made to feel like paper.
Okay.
And if I sent the Jack Smith report there, you can write on it and take notes. And add.
Oh.
So I use it to add, like the only time I ever send PDFs to my Remarkable is like when I have to edit something long and I don't feel like being at my computer with track changes. Like I want to watch TV with my wife and still look at a document and edit it. I can do that and I can circle things and underline them and write my note in the margin or whatever.
Okay. I'm going to check these out and we can report back.
Sounds good.